So Charles, what you have to do is open the meeting. You have to have a motion to open the meeting.
So a motion to open the May 2021 Budget Advisory Committee meeting.
I'll move it.
We have a
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 So I'm sorry I jumped into this. I have an ongoing work conflict the day after our meeting, which is tomorrow, and I wanted to see if everybody would be agreeable to maybe pick another day of the month. It's literally the second Wednesday of the month that I have this big thing. So the second Tuesday becomes an issue at night, cramming for this thing.
Well, it doesn't bother me to change the meeting. It's a question of, is there a particular day in the week that most people are free, or a day in the month? Sort of like, I'm looking at the village calendar in terms of all the different meetings that are done. What I would like to try and do is, if we're going to move it ahead of the Board of Trustees meeting as opposed to behind it. So, and if you do something and give them a week to review, I guess my question is, would the first Wednesday of the month work for you, for people?
It works for me.
Yep, for me as well.
That's fine.
I'm good.
Awesome.
Okay, so why don't we, I think, Charles, what you would need is a motion to move it to the first Wednesday of the month. We'll make sure that gets accomplished.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate that. So a motion to move our meeting to the first Wednesday of the month. And I guess we should clarify, are we, Dan, at 7 was what we were shifting to? That might have been a little better for you. I don't know if other people have work conflicts getting home in time, but that's where we were at, but they've been publishing the 7:30 inconsistently now.
I'm fine with 7.
Yeah,
I'm fine with 7.
I am too.
Me too.
Okay, so we'll do the first Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Is that what I'm hearing from everybody?
First Wednesday at 7, I second it.
Is that a permanent change or just for one meeting?
A permanent change.
Beginning in June,
That's correct.
beginning June.
The first Wednesday.
Great. And so that's good for everybody. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I
Aye.
Appreciate it. First Wednesday of the month going forward at 7 p.m. And we'll let Sally and Robert know.
I'm going to do that right now. Why we're on doing the rest of it.
Great. I don't know if I saw the minutes from the April meeting, and if I missed them, I apologize.
I didn't see them either.
No, I was planning to use Zoom to help me with the minutes, and they haven't done the Zoom yet, but I'll get them for this week.
Okay.
Who's doing the minutes
They
tonight?
haven't updated anything on Zoom since like the middle of April. I'm not quite sure why.
I think it's my turn, Alan.
I thought you did it.
I did, but I think we're going round 2 now.
Yeah.
Because everyone, certainly everyone on this call,
Right, Len, I thought you did it twice.
no, I don't think so. I may have done it twice. I can't remember now.
I think you did. John Campbell, you haven't done the minutes yet.
No, and you've got to defer. I don't think I could really do much of a job on them. I have memory problems and I can't read my own handwriting.
Okay,
So I did They asked me once before and I deferred a couple of months ago. and I'm
He's using the Biden defense.
What about Bill? I think I see Bill on the call. You're on mute, Bill.
I'll try to do one in the future, but I'm going to ask to pass on this.
All right, I'll do it tonight.
All right, Ellen, thank you.
Thanks,
Yep.
Ellen.
Thank you very much.
So, Dan, I was on last night's call for a lot of it, and didn't make it through all of it. I don't know if anybody else attended out of this group, but I just thought maybe you could share whether, with it being on the agenda last night, whether our capital budget planning principles document was adopted.
We did not get to it.
Okay.
It will be on the next work session.
They,
And I think and that will be on, where'd it go? Just a minute.
27th.
Yeah, I think so, but I need to just hold on. It's 24th.
24th.
Okay. And I think it would be helpful if somebody from the committee was there to give a very brief summary.
5:24 at 5 o'clock.
That's a Monday evening. And the work session starts at 5. So we would probably get to it somewhere around 5:30 or so.
That is a Monday, and that is not Memorial Day.
No,
Yeah,
Memorial
I
Day-
should be
Memorial
able-
Day is a week later.
That's right. I should be able to be on that, and if anybody else is,
Yeah, I might, yeah.
we can all shoulder up if we need to.
I will not be available.
I think I can make that one. It's
Well,
not-
Len, you were the primary author, correct? You and Ed?
Well, yeah, I wrote it with people's input, yeah.
Yep.
Well, I think Charles has a good handle. I mean,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
that's, it's gonna be at the work session, right, Dan?
Yes.
Well, if it's on the work session and it needs to be adopted, then it'll also be on the regular meeting.
Yeah, but the decision will be made at the work session if there are issues on issues.
Right.
Will the board have the document in advance? I believe it's been shared. And I don't know if there are any staff comments.
I thought the document was on the agenda last night.
It was on the agenda, but we didn't get to it.
No, but they had, the document was available to the public as well as to the board.
Yes.
Okay, well then that's good. Then I didn't know that. I don't know how much has been circulated. So there's no comments from the staff.
No comment from staff.
Okay, and yeah, I think, we've distributed it a number of times. But so we know that you have it, it's been posted, we'll be referencing the same version. And we can go from there. So with respect to reviewing the adopted budget, I don't think, per Glenn's request, the adopted budget has been posted. So for us to do any detailed review is probably, this isn't probably the time for that, but just, as an overview, the budget was adopted. it's a little unclear whether the capital budget being a part of that, and with it not having been at all addressed, whether that was included in the adoption. I suppose the answer to that question is yes, it was adopted. In what form is unclear. But do we want to go around the horn and just talk about our understanding of where things arrived at? We had comments and suggestions that we put forth that we did not receive feedback on. Whether any of those suggestions were incorporated, that being the last round of suggestions for the operating budget. And again, the capital budget suggestions that we made within that document, the capital budget was not discussed. So with that, I can turn it over to the group and we could go around the horn and just share thoughts about where we think we are with respect to the budget being adopted and where it's at. Obviously, when we have the document, it'll be easier to look at specifically where things ended up.
Well, they basically left the, they left the sales tax at the 3.666. Fine, because we just got our last sales tax and it came in over $1 million. So
Yeah, but what did they budget?
the budget was 3.667, I think.
Yeah,
is
but
what- is what's budgeted.
I hear, but how much more came in is my question.
We got another, I think it was 1.2 million.
You're saying we're 1.2 million over what was budgeted? No, that's not correct.
No. We're basically got like over 3 million in, and we have one more quarter to go. So we're gonna probably be 800,000 over what was budgeted. 3.2 million was budgeted. We're probably looking at 4 million coming in.
That's for the current year.
Well, that's the way they count the year. I had that question yesterday, and they said that the next quarter counts towards this year. I specifically asked, is that for the next 2 months? Or do you only count 2 months, or do you count the whole quarter? And the way they explained it to me is that the next quarter counts towards this year. Dan, am I correct in that? I asked that question yesterday.
Well, that's what I think you were told, but I'm not sure that that's the case because we can't book revenue until we actually receive it.
Yeah.
We can't accrue revenue.
Right, okay, so thank you, Dan. That was my question.
Yeah, I specifically asked that question last night.
I understand that, and I understand that the answer that you got, but I'm not sure that they understood the question correctly, because we've been told more than once that the village is not allowed to accrue revenue.
If that's the case, you're still probably looking at 3.8, somewhere around that. So, and the adopted budget for this year is 3.667.
All right, that's what we had.
Yeah. They took 90,000 out of the healthcare costs. They have 4 positions that they deferred for a half a year in order to finance the village attorney they want to hire. And they added 5,000 to a couple of revenue lines, and we're taking $600,000 out of the unattained or reserve fund, whatever you want to call it, to balance the budget this year. And there was absolutely no discussion of the capital budget. They have absolutely nothing right now.
No capital budget was adopted. So technically, we go back to the year before's capital budget. You know, but which is not a capital budget under any circumstances. It's a bunch of items without any planning.
And if you actually watched last night, we had a number of items, one of which wasn't even in the capital budget. They're looking to build a shed, a new shed down at the transfer station to cover the what's the machine called, Dan?
The compactor and the electrical equipment that runs it.
Electrical equipment. They've been working on it for a while, but the first time it was presented to the trustees was last night, and basically they had already sent the contracts out for the engineer, and they're looking at 60,000 engineer cost and 100,000 for the shed.
62,000
62,000 for,
engineering. And
and
the building will cost between 40 and 160, 40 and 100,000.
So that was something brand new. I'm sure they plan to put that under capital. You have a replacement.
But wait a sec, Glenn, hang on. I'm
Yes.
confused. If the capital plan or the request for the capital plan was just presented to us recently, how could this not have been included?
There was nothing in last year's capital plan.
No,
No, absolutely. That's the question that Dan was asking last night.
but it wasn't included in what was presented a month ago either.
It wasn't it wasn't
Nor
included. in last year's capital.
nor was the police boat for 400,000.
Whoa,
So of which we allegedly will get 75% funding, and we can sell a boat, and so they think it'll cost us $40,000. But
Yes.
Yeah,
the
just,
issue-
if we
the
could,
issue that I have, that I raised is, the ink isn't even dry on the budget. And we conceptually approved over $500,000 in payments for this coming year that have not been prioritized or included in any of the backup or discussions that went over the last few months.
yeah, and
And when I raised the question, we were told, the board was told that these were important items and that they have been pending. They've been pending for some time. So, and they've been working on the transfer station for over a year. And they've been working on the police boat for a few months.
Dan, and with that, I didn't watch the meeting live when the budget was adopted. There were issues with the links that ended up getting resolved. And when I went back and listened to the meeting, there was literally no mention of the capital budget. And I thought maybe the video got broken up into components, or that it was discussed in a different session. But I please correct me if I'm wrong, but that budget was adopted with literally not one word spoken about the capital budget.
There is no capital budget that was presented to the board.
Originally, the capital budget was being done by our village manager, and for health reasons, he was out for a month. He only came back this week.
Yeah, but Dan Sarnoff presented a spreadsheet with capital items on it.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, but with
And it
no,
was, hang on, it was agreed at that meeting that the Board of Trustees had to go through it and would prioritize it. These two items were nowhere on that list.
you're absolutely right, and they weren't on last year's list, which included a 5-year plan. Nowhere on the 5-year plan. In fact, I went through item by item. Dan had asked me, have you ever heard of this? And I literally went through item by item, 494 pages, and it was never mentioned last year, and it was never mentioned in any work session or any meeting of the Board of Trustees this year until it was presented last night.
And just to back up, and I you know, have to unpack this, that there was last year's capital budget, if you want to call it that. There was what's on the screen, which is what it is. We discussed it with the board. We sent this document to the board with suggestions about how, in a very accelerated window, to try to work with this. I understand that it was down to the wire, which is an issue in itself, but regardless, wherever you've ended up with either this or a decision to use last year's or to just do nothing, there wasn't one word spoken about.
But this is where, how we got to, we needed to write up recommendations. And all last year, it seemed to be, I don't want to call it a free-for-all, but certainly a first come, first serve. People go to the board, they present their case, money got approved for spending without looking at the total picture.
Basically, you're in a situation, it's broke, it needs to be replaced. Here's what we present, and then it gets voted on. And we have probably about $1.5 million worth of items that were approved last year that are going to have to be bonded by Augie next year, that are already purchased, we already own.
Yeah, but let's separate the issues here. Quite frankly, the individual projects are the individual projects. They've been approved, fine. The issue that Charles raised, the fundamental issue in my view, is there was no mention when the budget was adopted of any capital budget. There is, although I don't understand, I believe the state requires a capital and operating budgets approved by date certain, but there is no approved capital budget for fiscal year 22, I guess it is, as of right now. Nothing. Is that fair, Dan?
Yeah, there is no new capital budget for this fiscal year. There is, by law, I believe, if you do not adopt the budget, you go to the year before's budget, and that automatically is, goes forward. It's last year's budget.
Okay, but at any point, the trustees could say, okay, we're amending the capital budget, and here's the one for fiscal year 22.
Yep.
Okay, so now I don't know what the intent is going forward. It appears that the whole capital budgeting process seems to be an afterthought, or continues to seem to be an afterthought. And it's a concern, given the amount of money that we're talking about.
Well, I mentioned at yesterday's meeting, both in the first open to the public and the second open to the public, the fact that there was a lot of items that were being passed yesterday. There's other items that were being mentioned that we needed to prioritize what needs to be done in the capital budget and how to fund it. Because the other thing that got brought up again yesterday was the sidewalks for old Post Road, which laudable projects and everything. But what happens is they just seem to go down and, you know, we pass this, we pass this, we pass this. They don't have a budget of how much they can afford to bond this year. I says, that's the only reason I brought up that they've already got, you know, 1.5 million, whatever, you know, already that needs to be bonded. In our general fund, with what we have bonded, we pay off $1.74 million from our previous bonds. Any spending over that is going to affect the next year budget. So at what level are you comfortable? Can we borrow $4 million and bond projects? Can we do 3? That's one of the discussions that has to be made. And then what exactly are you going to spend the money on? Because again, we had $120 million worth of projects last year, and basically we didn't do most of them. So now we got 120 plus additional projects that have to be done starting this year.
And look, if we want to move on from this, what I'm going back to, you know, and we're going to just decide as a group that it's moot and not necessary at this point to address this, then that's our decision as a group. But I just don't want to move on from a budget having been adopted, and with all the work that was put into developing a framework, that there was no mention of it. And if by law it reverts to last year's budget and that was the best option, then that was a decision that could have been made and communicated. But I feel like there has to be accountability for this budget not having been mentioned at the meeting where the budget was adopted. Like, there wasn't one word. And Dan, am I wrong? But nobody said one word. If that's kicking the can down the road, then that's a decision. But nobody stepped up and said one word about this.
It sounds like to me, Charles, I'm sorry, Dan, for jumping in, but at a minimum, those of us who attend the meeting on the 24th on the capital principles, perhaps that's a good opportunity for us to share our thoughts with the board at that time, because otherwise those principles or anything else we do are totally meaningless.
And that's exactly why we wrote those principles months and months ago. I believe we first sent it to the board in October. So there is plenty of time for review, modification, and adoption, and to put into practice.
Okay, yeah. So I guess until then,
I think the answer is if you wish to express whatever you wish to express on the 24th, you can. I would suggest that you might want to not dwell on the past. You might want to mention the past and dwell on the future of how to proceed.
That's what I'm deliberating, quite frankly. But I think that I would agree with you in terms of what's done is done, and we want to be productive and move forward. But I'm having a personal ethical dilemma with how that was handled
Well,
and what our role is here.
there are a lot of issues that on the budgeting that are of concern, including the number of transfers we made last night from the general fund to fund activities that have taken place.
Unbudgeted activities?
Yeah, it was not budgeted and
Funded, yeah.
ran out of money in different departments for various salaries and other activities. And that happens over time. But in this case, I believe a good segment was known well in advance and just was never acted upon.
They don't actually make a change in the budget until the line's spent. And then they.
No, that's not true. That's not true, Glenn. We make it either when we have a problem or when we know that there's going to be a change and we are going to be short, that we do adjustments to accomplish a goal that has been agreed upon.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is they seem like the Parks Department and the Rec Department, they knew months ago that the salaries were gonna be over, and they kind of waited for them to be down to the last couple of $100, and then they made the adjustments for the rest of the year yesterday.
I guess to be continued. If everyone's agreeable, we could take a look back at, from the perspective of what we did last year, what we think worked with what we did and what didn't, and probably apply that to the overall process of what worked and what didn't. Obviously, we just talked about the capital budget and what didn't work.
The capital budget has to be looked at in a couple of different ways. Number one, we have continual equipment that needs to be upgraded, under $100,000, under $50,000. It's software, it's air conditioners, it's trucks and stuff with a 10-year life, 15-year life. You then have the long-term, once in a lifetime items that have to be addressed, that are the truly expensive ones. That would be your new Village Hall, seawall, paving of Halsted Avenue. And it has to be addressed how each of these items are going to be paid for, whether we're what is available in funding through state aid, through grants and such, how much we can afford to bond each year, and on the lesser items, are we going to do you need to have an operating budget that will have a surplus to help to pay for some of the other operating budget costs that are not as long-term? Because we're back to this year, the police cars are going to be bonded. I don't particularly care if the police cars are in the capital budget, but there has to be a means to pay for them, and you really can't bond them for 10 years because their useful life is done after basically 2 years, because the way they do the police cars in the Village of Mamaroneck, they buy 3 police cars, they put them on 24/7. They drive them for 1 to 2 years, and then they use those as the backup cars. And then 6 years down the road, they sell them at surplus.
But I think where this gets to, perhaps, if we follow Dan's advice and looking forward, is what concerned me about what we've gone through in this budget process for next year was the process itself and how it was handled. We had issues with both the capital budget and the revenue budget. So the discussion that we might want to have is, for example, if you just let me think this through just a couple of minutes. Augie sent us in January, I believe, his very preliminary estimates for the budget, revenue and expenses for the upcoming fiscal year. So we had a very preliminary budget, which quite frankly should be prepared and published and discussed among the board and among the budget committee very early on before we start the formal budget workshops that raise certain concerns or issues. The other piece is that every budget workshop with a department should be a discussion of revenues, expenses, and the capital budget for each department that has those items. Some have, let's say the clerk treasurer. Well, they have revenues like the sales tax, for example, and others, mortgage tax perhaps, where those discussions at those meetings can be had with the responsible party, as well as their particular departmental capital budget and operating budget. And as part of this process as well, maybe before we go in, is the whole issue of the capital plan, or maybe that takes place afterwards. I don't know. I haven't thought this through completely. But if the board buys the principles and criteria that we identified some time ago, we should have the 5-year plan, which was published in the budget for the current fiscal year. I believe that's correct. And are we going to work off that going forward? Of course, there'll be additions, changes, and so on. But as I'm hearing this conversation, it seems to me that we have to alter the content and timing once again of to what we do, but not alter the timing in a way that requires additional work by the staff. So
The other I'd like to add, Glenn said something very interesting, which was perhaps getting surplus in the operating budget. And the focus has been for several years to stay within the cap. So maybe, and I'm not sure when the right time to do it is, but maybe one time we bite the bullet, we stop taking money from the reserve fund to make the plan work, and we build up some excess. Just a thought.
As part of the operating budget, at some point, you have to incorporate what you're doing with the capital budget, because the operating budget is all your revenues outside of bonding, grants, and additional state aid from what is presented.
But also has debt service.
Right. And you can't simply take every single time you need a pickup truck, a police car, a fire chief's car. Not saying that you don't need them, but you can't put all this stuff into bonds because then there's no money left over to bond a village hall unless you're going to go back and be 5% over, do a 5% raise in your property tax in 2 years because your debt service is now so high, or make a large cut in services. The other thing that, we're all aware of is last year, we didn't know where we were with Corona. So they made a lot of adjustments, and they went on an austerity budget. Well, this year, they did the same thing. They basically put all the revenues back to pre-Corona, if not higher. Yet on the spending side, they went to an austerity budget in order to make the budget work. And at what point, are your departments sitting there going, if I buy one paper clip, it's okay, but if I buy a box of paper clips, I got to put it in the capital budget. You can't run a village on minimum wages and austerity budgets and cutting office supplies and training and electricity and water, forever. Well, the budget itself is running a $600,000 deficit this year.
Glenn, one thing I wanted to tie in that you've raised numerous times, and then in the context of what Len was saying, and in the context of what we've talked a lot about, is the long-term planning component of all of this and how these budgets can remain viable over the long term, and the interplay between the two budgets with respect to long-term planning. And to start with what Len framed as a more of a step one for the upcoming year, and to define how to refine that process, but then also to carve out time in the upcoming year to try to engage in the long-term planning process was a thought. And then related to that is that in looking at what worked and what didn't this past year, there was a period of time where there was a lot of engagement with Jerry and Augie and Dan Sarnoff, with a lot of information being shared. And I felt like that was really productive when we were doing that. And then during a period of the year, the information became less available. And I think if we can re-engage in that process where, part of what we do is to look at the actuals on an ongoing basis and really be able to see things in real time and have access to the information and understand which information is the most valuable to have access to, that's going to help the process. But I think that that's important to kind of pick that back up.
Right, but I'm going to go a totally different direction, Charles. I would almost like to hear from the board what they think our role and responsibilities are. Because we may be presuming, and I'm not disagreeing with our presumptions, that we're here to do ABC. But if we're beating our heads against the wall and no one's listening, or it's taking 8 months for someone to look at a 2-page document, is there agreement on what we're supposed to be doing? And in order for us to do what we think we need to do, we need the engagement of the board and we need the engagement of Jerry and Augie.
You also need engagement of the different departments, that if you do have a problem like they did at DPW, where they are aware that they are going to need to build a shed over the compactor, that information should be shared, that, hey, we're gonna need this in the capital budget, not, okay, we basically got the contracts ready with the engineers, here it is, and basically put it on a work session and have it approved.
Right, but I don't think we should have that engagement. I think,
No, that needs to be with the trustees, but
or with,
but if you have
Jerry.
if you have a heads up and we're told by the trustees, this needs to be incorporated in the capital budget, then you have a living document and you can make adjustments.
Yep.
If what we're gonna do is, as everything comes forward, well, this is what we're gonna pass, then what difference does it make if you have a capital budget? They're just going to pass what they think is most immediate sitting in front of them, without thought of how are we gonna fund it, or, you know, what other projects are need to be prioritized. Again, they were talking about the sidewalk on West Boston Post Road. That's, that's a project, that, needs to be done and everything. But again, does that jump ahead of the Hunter parking lot that has defects that on the state level needs to be fixed? Does that jump ahead of the little schoolhouse that has a leaking roof? You have the firehouse on Mamaroneck Avenue that, needs to be redone, loaded with asbestos and everything else. What priority, and when do you get to things? And eventually you can't push things off anymore. Halsted Avenue, Jerry was telling us in January that project had to be moved up according to the head of DPW. Now where does that lie? Is that going to be something that's going to be just thrown at you in July? That's and again, when the budget was passed, I said, good work, take 48 hours off. We have to work on the capital budget. I mentioned that the capital budget needs to be worked on at the end of the meeting last night. And I don't know what outside of Dan, I don't know what the feeling of the other four trustees are on the subject. And that's the feedback we need. Do you think that we need to do a capital budget and we're ready to help you with it? And between us, staff, and the trustees, iron out a capital budget, or you're just happy with whatever staff does and you're really not looking for our input? And that's the question that needs to be asked of the trustees.
Right, but that's why I was saying we need them to tell us what our role is.
Yeah, and to your point, Ellen, we did work fairly extensively on our mission statement. That may be something for the board to pull back up and to review. And, if there are changes that they think should be made to that, or focusing in on components of our mission statement, that would be a productive exercise. And looking at what the priorities are this year in front of them and in front of staff, and where there's the need for resources and input and advice. Those are all of the things, and that's why we're here. But at the same time, to say that the capital budget is not something that they want us engaging in, I'd have a very hard time accepting that at this point. And if that's the position that's going to be taken, I feel like I would need to really understand how things were going to change dramatically without all the help you can get.
Well, let's put things in perspective. Going backwards is not going to get us anywhere other than venting. going forwards with a constructive approach of, here we are, here's what we are think, we can be helpful to you on, here's what needs to be done. That you have so much in debt service that you can continue to use because you're retiring it, so you can put it back in with new debt. That translates to X dollars for, projects without tipping the scales. And after that, you tip the scales. And I think I think going back to what Len has suggested is, that not only do you need to consider the operating and, revenues and costs and capital desires, but the prioritization of the different issues associated with it. What happens if you don't put the shed up for a year? What happens if you don't buy the car for a year? Not saying that's what you're going to do, but just trying to understand the cause and effect, and then trying to help prioritize them. And I will tell you that whatever the budget committee comes up with prioritization will be reviewed and given serious thought by the board, but they will probably lean more heavily to whatever staff says it should be. But the fact is, we don't have that, and that's a major issue. And I think in terms of the mission statement, we've already went through that when we reconstituted the committee in 2009, early in 2019. So,
Look, I understand that it's generally in life, moving forward and not focusing on the past, is generally a productive way to proceed. But we've been at this for a while now, and I think when we all came together as a group, we identified, areas that we felt really needed to be worked on. And I feel like we've worked very hard to try to put together suggestions and a framework, particularly with respect to the capital budget, that is seemingly, being disregarded thus far. So,
well,
I just feel like there has to be retroactive accountability that as we move forward here, that, if we're going to leave decisions up to people to tell us what is necessary or where we're needed, and that's not part of it, that there may be the need to take issue with that. But I hear you. I just.
But then you have to put it into a framework of something, that you want to express and put it out there.
Dan, do you think it would be beneficial if we had a meeting with the board to kind of get their opinion on how they thought the budget season went and how we could help make it better going forward? Kind of leave it as an open-ended, what can we do for you? Would that be a waste of time or worthwhile?
Well, I'm not sure that I can answer that fairly, but let me try and give it a perspective. I think asking to have a work session with the Board of Trustees can be a meaningful approach. Asking them as to, or review, what can you do to help them? You're going to get a collage of answers. I'm not sure how productive that's going to be, but coming forth with a program of what you can do to help and how you can be supportive, I think would be much better received.
Okay, but, all right, so where I
The
was
board, the
kind of,
board, my opinion of our board is that we tend to be more reactive than proactive.
right, but where I was kind of coming from was, I think in order for us to put together an approach, and this is what we could do for you, we need to understand or hear their concerns with the past budget season. And I've heard some grumbling. But I think, if we got a list of concerns, A, B, C, D, E, were issues and we need to tighten that up, we could then take that list and come up with an approach to then present back to the board.
I'm not sure you would get a list from the board saying that there is anything that needs improvement.
Okay,
I think you would get a better reaction of saying, here are things that we think, were accomplished, and here are things that we think we could do better, and here's how we can help. And you may get resistance to that, or you may get endorsement to that, but you would get a far better productive dialogue and discussion.
okay.
Would you say, Dan, thank you, Dan, I think that was very helpful. If we were to ask each of the trustees, I'm asking you to speculate, about their own personal views of the process and their comprehensive understanding of where the village stands fiscally and what the key issues are in the budget in any particular year. Do you think that the trustees have a really good understanding or very rudimentary at best? What I'm trying to get at is, it just seems to me there just seems to be so much misunderstanding or confusion. And maybe that's just an error on my own thinking among
No.
the trustees.
I don't think that's an error on your part, but I don't know that you would get a totally open answer. I think you will have some that says everything is fantastic. We're in great fiscal shape. We have no problems. And yes, we can do a little bit better on this, that, and the other thing, but we're great. Staff's doing a good job, and we appreciate everything you've done to help. I think that is one aspect of what you will get. I think other aspects might be, we're tight. We're not sure where we're going. It was we have a pandemic year, but we made it through, and we're in good shape. And I think there are others who are very concerned, but I'm not sure how they would express that in a joint meeting. I can't tell you. I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think given our role, Ellen, I think it would be helpful if we could, if we have such a meeting, if we could share with the trustees our thoughts on how we can make things better or clearer. And because presumably, if we can assist in decision-making, meaning presenting the information in a clear and concise way, then that might be helpful. I'm just trying to think of, if our role is as an advisory committee, it should be us that come up with the advice as to how we can either improve the process, improve the decision-making, and help with some of the information, like the profitability of different programs, which you've mentioned, Ellen, many times, that might be useful. That's all. I'm trying to think of a more positive
So
approach.
let me give you a suggestion that I've made at other communities, and they've seemed to have worked well, but they don't have the same dynamics that we do. But that the budget committee comes up with a report card not a scolding report card, but a proactive report card. You know, things went well, we balanced the budget, you know, but here are the issues. We did buy, you know, we are $107 under the cap, you know. But here are things that we could do for the reports and the budgeting. Len, you've talked about the difference between the hundreds of pages of materials versus summary approaches first. You know, so that you have a better feel of the entire picture. That when you go through departments, you go through all of it at one time, not just one thing and then go back to the other. So I think there are ways you can make a significant contribution to a path forward, which is what I think I'm hearing from everybody in different approaches of how do we go forward and how can we be constructively be helpful and be heard. Unless I've misunderstood it, that's what I'm hearing.
I think that was really positively presented. And I wanted to say that, you know, what's encouraging to me is that, you know, when I look at, you know, three of the big players involved here, who are Jerry, Augie, and Dan Sorno, and I look at the sophistication that they've applied to a lot of what they're doing across most of what we're talking about, there's a lot of acumen and a lot of detail and a lot of structure that's gone into developing these frameworks. And it's there and it's ready to be brought home. And I feel like our role can be, you know, to help that process of integrating it into the finish line. And that's what we can be here for. So it's almost like it's too complicated, and there are these moving parts that are highly sophisticated, and it's getting it to the basics to bring it home. And if we can help with that process, I think that, you know, that would be a great use of, you know, our skill sets and what our role could be.
That's well put, Charles.
Understand, the position that Jerry, Augie, Dan, Sally, Laura are put in is, this is the budget. This is how much money we brought in last year. We don't want to lay off anybody. We don't want to fire anybody. We have obligations that have to be met, and we want to be 2% under the cap. Now come up with your numbers. I don't know if the trustees have ever asked the staff, you know what, if you weren't constrained by last year's numbers and you had your druthers, what do you think the budget would actually look like?
I would ask the question differently, Glenn. If you were just forming X department today,
Yes.
what would it look like?
If you were a fresh slate,
Yep.
and you to fund both operating capital, what do you think it would actually look like?
Right, but that's the reason why I'm saying you were just starting
Yes.
isn't based on, well, I have 20 employees, so we're gonna keep 20.
Right.
If you were just starting, you might only need 15.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or is
Wait. 25. What?
well, yeah. Or is it better to have in staff or a private company do it?
Yep.
That's absolutely true. Now, understand the other thing is, and they have to incorporate, like the rec department, I actually watched their last meeting. They're looking to come before the trustees to hire a engineer to look at the feasibility of a dog park. Again, that's not a problem, you know, if that's what they want to get. But here's another thing that I've never seen in a capital budget. I've never seen it mentioned before, yet they're that, this is something going on. The tree committee has its ideas. There's not a problem with that, but it has, if you're looking at that, there has to be at least a heads up somewhere that we're looking at this. How can we incorporate it in your spending over the next year? And that's why we need to get a capital budget adopted. And the most important part of it is, at what level spending do you have? Exactly how much can we borrow with bonds to accomplish the capital, for capital spending, and then prioritize the list. And then if something comes up, what has to come off the list in order to make to accommodate anything that comes up during the year? Or are you going to increase what you're going to do with the capital spending? But you at least have to have a capital spending budget to work off of. Right now, you have nothing. It's like, what we spend, whatever gets to the board, we spend. And I don't think that the board even keeps track of the amount of money that they pass. I think what happens is Augie adds everything up at a date certain in July or November or whatever. He says, this is what we got to bond this year. And then they bond it.
So at the meeting on the 24th, we'll be available to discuss the capital budget planning principles document that will hopefully be adopted. We can talk about how we can help in the process if we want to go further and take an active role in helping to prepare that. We're here to do that. That might be a good sequitur into subcommittees and kind of the plan going forward. Do we want to talk about subcommittees for the upcoming year and some of the things that we want to be working on, or do we want to wait another month and gather ourselves? Do you guys have thoughts on that at this juncture?
I would wait until hopefully by June 1st, the adopted budget is up. And then I would look to do that. If we need a subcommittee to look into how the operating budget is going, and then another subcommittee to get into the weeds of exactly what we spent on capital projects so far, and basically, start to keep track of the capital spending. Now, one of the nice things that is now available is, if you look, you have that monthly report they're now doing, results of operations. That is very, very helpful. And the fact that they are doing a income and expense report along with the abstract of the bills every 2 weeks or every meeting is much helpful, because you can see the numbers in real time. In fact, in the last report of operations, was actually a nice sheet attached to it that showed you when expected revenues were expected to come in for each revenue line. I don't know if you got a chance to look at it. So basically, it had the breakdown of state aid normally comes in April. You have quarterly payments for the sales tax. You have semi-annual payments for the mortgage tax. And it basically went down the list of all our revenues and when the revenues were expected. That way you have a better idea of exactly how, the revenues are coming in. And you can start to do a similar list for that for your expense side, because, in December that's when you have to pay the police retirement fund and the employee retirement fund. I think in the first week in June is when we have to pay the majority of the workman's comp. And then, you're looking at the revenues and expenses, and you're seeing in real time what they are, and you now know what to anticipate based on when either the revenue is going to be coming in or when the expense has to go out, to have a real idea of where the budget stands at any given moment. And like I said, we're also supposed to be getting money in from pandemic recovery, which is going to help. And we have the American Act that is going to give us money. But if we don't get it by June 1st, which I doubt this year, we're going to get half of it this year. We're going to get half of it next year. And I think it's, Dan, you can give me the number. It's about 700,000, 2 payments, 1.4 total. Is that
Nobody
true?
knows yet. We haven't been told, but it's been estimated. Depends on who you talk to at that level or a higher level. I'm not counting my chickens until they're hatched.
The bottom.
But I'd like to go back to where Charles was for the 24th. I think it's helpful to be somebody there, but I think either prior to that, if you all want, I can ask, or at that meeting can ask for a work session to see how we can help move forward for this year. I think I do not see at the work session a tremendous amount of time being spent going through this. It'll either get done quickly or it'll get passed back to staff for comments. But I do not see with the 20 odd items on the agenda, I do not see a lengthy amount of time devoted to this. But I can see an agreement within a month or two of getting a work session with the board to be constructive on moving forward.
I think that's a good idea. Maybe we should spend 100% of the next meeting in June figuring out exactly what it is we want to propose and form the subcommittees, et cetera. But, really have that plan of attack clearly defined to put in front of the board.
I agree.
That sounds like a good plan. And if the budget's posted by then, we can get our heads around with how that came together, digest it, incorporate that into our reconvening and coming up with our own plan for the year, and then communicating that hopefully in a work session with the board, get their feedback back, and be able to go from there with a plan for the year.
Yep.
Okay, that sounds great.
And
Did anyone have any?
On the positive side, when the budget was adopted, at least a couple of the trustees basically said that at the very least needs to be looked at in the second week in October after summer's over to see exactly where the budget stands. So they at least have a mindset that they're just not going to adopt the budget and then leave it for a year.
And I think it's helpful to come up with both generalities and specifics on things that could be done. And I think laying the groundwork at this point would make your work more productive as we go through the year.
All right. I think we had a good year. I think we worked great as a team and produced a lot of, valuable things that can be used going forward. I don't think it was all for naught, and I think a lot of it is going to work for us and the village going forward. So we'll continue hopefully with our own momentum, and hopefully have a great year with this. Does anybody have anything they want to address or bridge at this point, or we make a motion to adjourn? And
The one thing you might want to ask is, ask Jerry if he has a idea when he is going to have an updated capital plan for this year, because I know that's what he was working on before he went out for a month.
Right, but
And-
I think Dan finished that. I think that's what Dan presented to us, Glenn.
Yeah, but there was no cost analysis at all involved. The last.
I know,
one-
but I think that's all that was gonna be done.
Well, then, we'll have to take Dan's document, and I'm not quite sure how you prioritize it without knowing the cost of items, but that's something we'll have to ask the trustees.
Well, there were costs associated with most of what was in that.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
And I asked today for that to be distributed to the budget committee. But obviously it was not done today.
well, yeah,
I assume it wasn't done today because they want to revise it in anticipation of getting it to you. But in either event, it's a good starting point.
yeah, and with that document, just revise what they think they're gonna be getting either in state aid and grant money for the different projects. And,
That's included. That was there.
Yeah,
It was,
but I said, if they're gonna revise it, they should revise that too.
yep.
And then, it comes down to the trustees, at what level do you want to bond? What do you want to spend? You start with 1.74 because that's what we're paying back in principal on our general. Anything over that, it would involve additional spending the following year. And they have to tell us what level of comfort they are of bonding of what we're getting in grants and state aid, and then you priority list, and and if anything comes up during the year, you're either going to have to adjust how much you want to borrow, or you're going to have to reprioritize the list and at least know where the different stand on the list.
Well, I think that, but you can't talk in terms of the 1.74. That's the amortization. So you have to take that, that translates to for the total and keep a running total. And if we approve things coming out of the reserves, it has to show how much we have to have keep a running total. We don't keep running total.
It's just my EF and then my last name at AOL.
Oh, but what I was talking about, Dan, wasn't amortization. What I was just talking about is what we're paying back in principal. Because if you pay back 1.7,
It's EF.
borrow
My
1.7.
name at AOL.com.
Hey, Ed, can you mute your phone, please?
Outside of the difference in it should leave you
Yeah, I remember that.
borrow
That was like a deja vu moment.
is going to be additional costs both in principal and interest.
It's okay. You have to do what you have to
But
do.
the following month.
I'm an understanding person, you know that.
Right,
What
but Glenn, I You know, it
And I
seems
did,
that,
and I did talk to Roberta, and we will be here.
Ed, is it possible for you to mute yourself? I don't know how to do that.
We will need somebody to substitute for it.
so Glenn, it does seem to
And that'll
your
be done
point
at
that
2:00.
we are knowingly, you succeeded, Dan, that was excellent. We are adding more debt to the plan than we're paying back each year. And the debt service line is accounting for that.
Yes,
So in
That-
addition, hang on, in addition to our expenses going up out of our control due to salaries and benefits, that one's going up as well. So if we're gonna keep on that path, other things have to give, or we're gonna have to bite the bullet and come in over the cap, which I don't think anybody wants to do.
correct. Either that or you have to cut services or raise more
Yep.
fees.
Yep,
But you just significantly raised your fees. How much more are you gonna raise the fees? And last year, understand, we borrowed 5.2 million, and basically all of it was non-water, non-sewer related.
yep,
We already have, and this is what I keep trying to get across, we've already purchased for this year somewhere between 1.5 and $2 million worth of products that are non-water, non-sewer related.
yep,
Therefore, if we went to bond next year, just what we have currently, we'd either be neutral or we'd be borrowing money. And yesterday, they added $100,000 to the cost eventually when that gets paid. You
Yeah,
know,
but the 1.7 is the total capital expenditure. Is that what you're saying,
no,
Glenn?
no, the 1 point, what we owe like $45 million.
The 1.7 is the principal of the $3.2 million debt service number. That's
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And if you spend the principal, you're keeping the bond at level.
Right, right. So then what's the,
Anything
what
over-
does the 1.7 convert into capital spending during any given year? And presumably that's a function of the use, the structure of the bonds. I'm not sure if they're all the same. But you may recall, the members of the committee, that when we talked this with Augie, he was saying, well, we can fund on an annual basis, on a level debt service basis, somewhere around, what was it, 4 to 8 million a year?
Yep.
Or 5
Yep.
to 8 million a year?
Yep.
So essentially, we can fairly easily, I put that in quotes, do as Charles said, which is you go down to the point of your $8 million in village funded capital expenditures, and you draw the line and say, by setting our priorities, everything above the line we can do, anything below it we can't. So therefore, setting the priorities becomes a key exercise in putting together the capital budget.
Absolutely right.
The portions of which,
But
the
in
portions
that,
of which will be funded by the village. Now, there's, like on the list that Charles had up, he had other sources of funding for certain of the items, which, as we were told, we expect to get some, was it CHIPS or some of the street funding?
Yeah, you have CHIPS, you have New York Pave, and you have extreme weather, and they all went up this year. And between the group of them is probably like a $500,000.
there's also something for New York bridges.
Yeah, that's another program that's gonna be paying for the majority of the Hillside Bridge.
Yep,
And that's being done town of Rye, Village of Mamaroneck. And then the other bridge that's being replaced is actually the town of Mamaroneck's. Waverly Avenue is the town of Mamaroneck. They actually are in charge of maintaining and replacing that bridge. But the bridge program, I think, is like 95%. But again, this is the list that we have to have. That's like when they presented the boat, they told us that there's a grant out there that will pay 75% of the cost of the new boat. We got a $250,000 safety grant, which paid for our police cars and a bunch of fire equipment, including the Scott Pack, some oxygen tanks and bunker gear in last year's budget. Well, you know, they have to let us know what we have money that is owed to us. What is owed to us for things that we've already paid for, that we're carrying, and what have we already applied for, and what can we apply for? And that has to be part of the overall capital budget. The other thing is, Augie said, yes, we can spend X amount, but understand, for every $1 million that you spend over the 1.74 principal that we paid back is a 0.25% increase the following year on your property tax. So if you borrow $4 million, that's going to cause a 1% increase in your budget. And
I'm not sure I agree with that. So when Dan Natchez, you might remember the emails. Last year when we were going through the new fire engine at like 900,000, $1 million, I believe Augie sent out an email saying that it would cost us about 52 to 55,000 a year in interest, or in the debt service.
I don't remember, Ellen. I can't
that would
tell.
be you're absolutely right. That would be.
But that was total debt service, so part of that was paying back principal. That's what I'm saying. I'm not sure I agree on the.
Let me just do a quick. If you're talking about 20 years, right? If you borrow $4 million over 20 years, you have to pay back $200,000 a year in principal, and then the interest that's on top of it. And basically, we have our property taxes around 26 million. So if you have to pay 260,000 back, and your property tax is at 26 million, it's somewhere right around 1%. It might be 0.9%. It might, but maybe it's 4.4 million. You could do the exact math. But
Right, but it depends what else is dropping off.
Well, that I've already said that 1.74 million is going to drop off. Any spending above that, if you spend 4 million above that, it's going to be another 0.9%. And the problem you have right now is we're deficit spending 600,000 in the operating budget, and you have 4 positions that they didn't fill in order to make this happen, that they're planning to fill within the next 6 months, that
sure.
are, and maybe not, but would be in next year's budget.
Yep, full year next year.
Yeah. So basically, you can plan on the 2% isn't exactly 2%. It's probably more, 2.8% to stay under the cap when you do all the math. But just to make up the $600,000 is, if you actually made up the 600,000, would be 2% by itself.
Yep.
And that's with no raises at all. And, the rest of your budget taken care of anything. And you know, the employees have a contract and they get 1.97% raises. So what you can spend on bonding and still not go over the 2% cap would be the question you'd have to ask. Without making cuts to the budget. And that's where, the, you're gonna have to have the trustees get together with staff, actually crunch the numbers and say, if we spend this much debt, this is the percentage that, we're gonna go up next year, and understand that that only leaves X amount left. So,
Is there anything else on the agenda, Charles?
No,
No.
that was it. And I think we had our plan for next steps. I'll look to hopefully see some of you guys on the 24th. We'll see how that goes, and then move forward into the next steps that we discussed, and gathering ourselves after we look at the budget once it's posted, have a productive meeting in June, and then try to get together with the board for a work session, help get a plan for the year, and move forward.
Thank you. I just want to add one thing. I do think that, at least I hope everyone agrees, to thank Dan Natchez, who got us, who sort of, I think, injected us into the process. There was some original resistance, I understand, about our participation during the budget workshops in other parts of the process, including, sharing information with us. And I thought Dan was particularly diligent and forceful and very helpful in, getting information to be shared with us, the committee. So I want to thank Dan.
And I want to add to that, Glenn. I think, Dan, you're also very good at advising us so we don't do missteps with the right intentions, but they could still be missteps. So we're not an easy group, but you have a lot of patience with us. So
No, I think I'm very happy with the group. I think you are very hardworking. You have some great ideas and are bringing forth disciplines that I think are very important for the village to be more attuned to and hopefully, adopt. And it takes, this village takes a while to move forward quickly. So, every small step is a good step.
and to be fair to this set of trustees, unfortunately, a lot of what is sitting around that needs to be done in the capital budget has been 20 years of kicking the can. I mean, we were talking about refurbishing that village hall 30 years ago. I mean,
it would have been a lot cheaper 30 years ago. That's for sure.
Absolutely. 30 years ago, and redoing the Hunter parking lot 20 years ago, and redoing the firehouse 15 years ago. And the fact they didn't pay for 5 years, other boards wanted to balance their budgets too, and the way they did it was they kept pushing projects off, and unfortunately now some of these things are at the end of their life cycle, and this board has to deal with it. One of the things they did do is they bit the bullet and they raised the sewer tax 38%. The sewer fees went up 38%, and I'm sure sometime within the next month or two, they're going to have to deal with the water rates, which are going to go up substantially, because not only do we have the infiltration plant in the county, we have a lot of local projects that have been done over the last couple of years, and they need to be bonded and funded. So It's, you know, it's just not a simple task. You know, they are very aware that the taxpayers do not want to see that tax rate go over the 2% cap because they don't get the second check
Yep.
in cases for the homeowners. You know, so, you know, unfortunately, that artificial cap that's on is a hindrance to, you know, actually having a working budget in the village.
So Dan, totally unrelated. Did the reimbursement rate get increased?
Which reimbursement?
Police.
Police reimbursement.
No, but the board did discuss it in last night and are in favor of doing it. And
Okay,
that's one of the things that I think, Charles, you may want to include, because there would be receptivity to that.
To move that forward
Yes,
to be adopted.
now Jerry wants to also couple that with a law that requires the police to be used. That's a different issue.
yeah.
Should we make a motion to adjourn? Is it?
I
I'll move to
second.
adjourn.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Thank you all for your time, energy, and diligence in this.
Thanks for taking the
Thank
minutes,
Thank you,
Ellen.
Dan.
No problem. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dan.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
I know.
Good night.